contemplating intervention.
I'm going to have to compress a lot of information into a very short space. The background is here in my book, Supernatural, the factual background. I've recently become a novelist. That's entirely thank you to the creative input of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca gave me a novel, told me to go home and write it, and that's what I'm doing now. So it's also about altered states of consciousness. I think that altered states of consciousness are the universal feature of shamanism. If somebody is in the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness and they claim to be a shaman, they're definitely not a shaman. They may be something else, something useful, but they're not a shaman. Shamanism is about altered states of consciousness, and there are many ways to induce the necessary altered states. However, it's just a fact that universally it is the visionary plants that are most frequently used by shamans to enter altered states. There are other techniques as well. It's very common for shamans in the shamanistic state of consciousness to report encounters with intelligent supernatural entities, which are usually construed as spirits. And very commonly these take animal form or therianthropic form. That's from the Greek therion, which means a wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. And shamans of all cultures report transformations that they themselves transform into animal forms as they enter the spirit world. It's very strange, and I'll go into this here, that many of the experiences that shamans report with the entities that they construe as spirits are pretty much identical to those that people who believe they've been abducted by UFOs construe as aliens. And in fact, in quite a lot of shamanistic art, for example, Pablo Amaringo's art, we do see that the spaceship, the flying saucer motif, keeps coming up again and again, mixed with the incredible saturated colors of ayahuasca imagery. If we want a resource background on the phenomenology of shamanism, of course there's a massive literature, and everybody knows of Mircea Eliade's majestic work on shamanism. We have fantastic resources on the experiences of shamans. And thanks to researchers like the late Dr. John Mack from Harvard University and others, we also have a huge dossier of information on the experiences of UFO abductees. And this allows us to compare these two supposedly entirely separate domains, the domain of spirits and the domain of quote-unquote aliens. And I just want to run through some of those similarities. Shamans most frequently encounter spirits in animal or in therianthropic form. And although popular culture puts a lot of emphasis in the UFO literature on greys, so-called grey entity, it's actually the case, if you look at the literature in detail, that many UFO abductees first encounter the aliens in animal form. So Virginia Horton found herself talking with an intelligent grey deer. Another saw a deer looking through her window. Another had a wolf standing squarely on her bed. And John Mack sums it up that the aliens appear to be consummate shape-shifters, taking on many different forms, raccoons, deer, owls, and so on. Very typical shamanistic experience to sense being floated up into the sky, and very specifically to climb a thread or a rope of light into the heavens. And again, these kinds of experiences are reported again and again by UFO abductees. I sort of feel like I'm on an elevator, except there's no walls or anything around it. It's just up fast. Another UFO abductee reports a line or a thread of light extending from her navel. Another sees light like a spider's thread and climbs up it. I'm illustrating here some of the San rock art from South Africa, which illustrates similar experiences. Shamans are not only abducted into the sky, but they're also abducted into underground locations. We see here from one of Pablo's ayahuasca paintings, the shaman being drawn down beneath the Amazon to the city Encante by two therianthropes, two mermaids carried underwater. And many shamans report encountering spirits in cave environments. And as you can see from these texts here, this is also very common with UFO abductees, that they're abducted, plunged into the sea, entering huge crystalline caverns, going to a tunnel beneath the sea. Carlos Diaz finds himself in a cave with stalactites and stalagmites and a UFO. The shamanic ordeal is one of the universal themes of shamanism, the sense of being pierced by spirits, of being tortured by spirits, of undergoing some kind of strange surgery. Very commonly, bone counting is reported by shamans. They report bizarre surgical experiences, procedures at the hands of spirits, and they report having objects inserted into their bodies, such as stones, rock crystals, and other objects. It's a universal theme of shamanism, and it's a universal theme of UFO abductions as well. They also regularly report strange surgical procedures that are carried out on them by the supposed aliens. And again, you can read for yourself the examples here. I mean, it's really quite astonishing that a Siberian shaman has his bones counted, and so does a UFO abductee. Shamans are constantly having sex with spirits, and they're having children with spirits as well. I have met a shaman whose wife has left him because of his relationships in the spirit world. And oddly enough, the same thing is reported again and again by UFO abductees. Sex with aliens is a very common experience in the UFO abduction phenomenon, that they have a lover in the alien realm, that they have hybrid offspring, and that they are abducted repeatedly to nurture and cuddle their hybrid child. Shamans sometimes report being given books. Maria Sabina worked with Gordon Wasson, famously was given a book which helped her to do her work better, to know the secrets of the world where everything is known. So was Betty Hill given a book, large luminous pages reclaimed from her. Similarly, Betty Andreasson. And both UFO abductees and shamans tend to return from their experience with a sense of mission, sense of responsibility, and a feeling that they have healing powers. Now another domain, fairies and elves, which became ludicrous just at about the time that UFOs started to appear in our, or to be construed as UFOs in our culture, around about the 1940s, 1950s. They also have an awful lot in common with aliens and spirits, and I want to pay tribute to the fantastic work of Jacques Vallée in his book Passport to Magonia, 1969, which first introduced the notion that there were stunning connections between the experiences of UFO abductees and the experiences of those who'd encountered fairies. What I did in Supernatural, in part, was just to take that dossier of information on from 1969 up to today. So fairies, just like spirits, just like aliens, they were in the business of abducting people. You did not want to get close to the fairy dance. You'd be drawn into it. You'd find yourself in another world. You might sense 2 or 3 hours or an afternoon passing, but when you returned, you would find that 100 years had passed and that you were just a memory in the village that you'd come from. A little bit like an extreme example of the missing time phenomenon in UFO abductions. Fairies could be cruel, they could torture us, they could also give gifts and healing powers. They had the power of flight. They used all manner of aerial vehicles, which are construed as flying boats, flying castles, flying carriages, etc. Very frequently, fairy abductions would involve being abducted underground into the hollow hills. You can all read the texts here on this page. It's interesting that mushrooms do appear in both of these woodcuts, a clear Amanita muscaria here, and I would bet a psilocybe down here. And fairies and elves also take animal form. It's very common. This is a woodcut from Holland in the 16th century. Shows a group of fairies dancing in a ring. If you look at them closely, you can see that they are therianthropes, part animal, part human in form. Melusine, a feared medieval fairy, part serpent, part woman. She was feared for abducting human babes and substituting a changeling in their place. And well, there are many, many reports of women being abducted to nourish hybrid fairy children, and also in the UFO abduction context to hybrid human-alien children. So we humans, we can't look at anything without interpreting it. There's no such thing as interpretation-free perception. Interpretation's built into perception from the get-go. And what I'm suggesting is that actually we're looking at precisely the same cultural phenomenon here, simply viewed through different cultural spectacles in different periods of history and construed in different ways. And I believe it's possible to trace this phenomenon very far back in time. If we just remind ourselves of some of the common forms in which aliens and spirits and fairies appear, notably the form of therianthropes. The oldest piece of cave art to have come down to us from anywhere in the world is this piece from Fumani Cave in Italy, a classic therianthrope with the head and horns of some kind of bull, an auroch, and the body of a human being. Hollenstein Stadel Cave, 32,000 years old, carved from mammoth ivory, a lion man. And this amazing piece from Chauvet, a bison man, and indeed the bison man appears again and again in the painted caves over a period of more than 10,000 years. The sorcerer, part horse, part stag, part owl, part wolf, part human from Troffrere Cave, 17,000 years old. We have to ask ourselves, where did these ideas come from? What was the source of these notions? Clearly, this is not something that is observed in everyday life. And if we pull back from this image, we can see that it's more complex than it appeared at first. There is the bison man here, but he's straddling a female figure. The female figure is headless, and yet her right arm is transforming into the head of a lion. So let's not pretend that we're dealing with somebody dressed up in skins here. What's being captured here is a moment of transformation or shape-shifting from one form to another in a piece of art that is more than 32,000 years old. Look at these strange images from Los Casares Cave in Spain, and from Angoulême in France, because it's not only the therianthropic form that appears in the caves. For example, here from Peshmerga, look at that curious profile of that high domed forehead and that narrow pointed chin, the large dark eyes, and some object above the entity there, whatever the entity is. I've done a redrawing of that figure, and to my eye, it does look a lot like the modern alien idea, the so-called grey. And in fact, you can find objects painted on the walls of the caves that nobody knows what they are. Archaeologists don't have a clue, but they do look astonishingly to me like Pablo Amaringo's paintings of flying saucers, which he saw more as entities or intelligences or even vehicles for entering and leaving the spirit world. Of these three images, two were created more than 20,000 years ago, and one was created in 1990 by one of John Mack's patients. She said that every time the aliens came to abduct her, they would project this pattern into her visual field, and that's how she knew that she was going to be abducted. The modern image is this one, and the ancient images are these. I think we're looking at the same inspiration in every case. I definitely don't take a totally nuts and bolts explanation of this. I don't think that the phenomenon is as simple or as easy as high-tech aliens coming here in incredibly sophisticated spacecraft from the other side of the galaxy. I think it's much more complicated and much more mysterious than that. I've got nothing against physical aliens. I'm sure the universe is full of life, but I don't think that that fully explains this phenomenon, and that actually we can't get to grips with this phenomenon unless we get to grips with altered states of consciousness, DMT and psilocybin being important in some of the research. Now, this was recently published in New Scientist in 6th of March 2011, earliest evidence for magic mushroom use in Europe, from the Selva Pasqualo mural in a cave near the town of Villar dell'Uomo. And you can see the mushrooms, the Psilocybe hispanica, that have been identified in this image. The image is in fact about 6,000 years old, but there's evidence of psychedelic use going back much further than that in the works of art themselves. And just to quickly run through the kind of thing, it's often a combination of an animal and a geometric figure that we see again and again in the cave art, like this grid over here in front of this cow, and here a grid between two ibexes, and here from Altamira, these curious patterns and shapes more than 30,000 years old, and again from El Castillo, flows of dots running down a cave wall, strange distorted rectangles and grids. If we're going to explain cave art, we have to be able to explain all of these different characteristics. And scientific research that was done in the 50s and 60s with psychedelics really do help us to understand what is going on here. The fact that there has been a blockage on research with psychedelics for so long has meant an interruption in the addition of our information, but I hugely welcome the fact that new psychedelic research is now going on. What we need to be doing, however, is not only looking at the therapeutic aspects of this, but looking at the phenomenology and seeing what this means to us about the nature of reality. Again, I'm having to cut a long story, extremely short indeed, but those researchers in the 50s and 60s established certain regular patterns which are almost always reported by people on a powerful hallucinogen. And these were given the name entoptic phenomena. And it's really a simple work of deduction. In the case both of the San and the Koso, we were actually told by ethnographers who contacted them before they were wiped out that these artworks were done by their shamans who entered visionary state and returned and depicted on the rock shelters what they had seen in the visionary realm. We can't interview shamans from the Upper Paleolithic, but the fact that the same patterns recur over thousands of years, always involving altered states of consciousness, really makes it certain that the essence of cave art is altered states of consciousness and the shamanistic experience. Those researchers with hallucinogens in the 60s tried to identify a kind of typology, stage 1, stage 2. You go through a vortex, you find yourself in a seamlessly convincing parallel world, and there you encounter intelligent entities. And this one was done by one of the mescaline researchers in the 1960s, one of the subjects. He entered that parallel world, and this was the entity he encountered, dressed in a modern business suit, but with the head of a fox. A classic therianthrope would have been instantly recognizable despite the business suit to somebody from 30,000 years ago. And in fact, we have really fantastic research on this now. Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa has absolutely nailed this down, that altered states of consciousness explain the universal features of cave art. And it's the combination of these patterns, particularly with therianthropic figures, that make it quite certain. So once we accept that altered states of consciousness were involved, then all the strange visionary aspects of cave art make sense, and we can begin to understand the inspiration for such imagery because we've seen such transformations ourselves in altered states of consciousness. This is an area of research into prehistory which I feel is sadly neglected. We do need to really investigate altered states of consciousness if we're going to understand almost any aspect of prehistory. Rick Strassman's amazing work at the University of New Mexico, giving dimethyltryptamine to human volunteers in the 1990s, really helps to bring all this together. Actually, we're all illegal in this room. I'm sure everybody knows we do all have DMT in our bodies. It's found in blood plasma urine. It's a natural brain hormone. And it's the first psychedelic to be known to be produced naturally by the body, and nobody knows why it's there. It's thought that it's produced in the pineal gland. And the pineal gland was originally a sense organ. Lizards and amphibians, the pineal gland actually still contains a lens, a cornea, and a retina. It's sunk deeper into the brain in humans. It's not sensitive to light anymore, but I would suggest that it is still a sense organ, and that dimethyltryptamine is the lens that is being applied to the senses through the pineal gland. So if we just look briefly at some of the experiences reported by Rick Strassman's volunteers, we can see that they cross over into these other domains. These guys were on a hospital bed in the University of New Mexico. They were not being physically abducted anywhere, but it appears that their consciousness was being abducted. Carl sees a lot of elves. Ben has something inserted into his left forearm, fiber optic things probing into his pupils. A space station is mentioned. Again and again, the experiences of these volunteers is very, very similar to or identical to the experiences reported by UFO abductees. And oddly enough, a number of the volunteers reported being told almost the same things by the entities they encountered. Basically, we're so glad you've discovered this technology. Now we can communicate with you more often, meaning DMT. So more than half of the volunteers actually reported experiences that are directly comparable with those of UFO abductees. And this needs to be explained. Rick is of the view that UFO abductees may be individuals who spontaneously overproduce dimethyltryptamine in the brain. It puts them into a trance state, and then they have this experience. And it's really important to emphasize that Rick is absolutely clear that this does not imply that such experiences are just your brain on drugs, or that such experiences are not real. There's very bad logic that leads us to conclude that such experiences are not real. If we want to look, to make this point, there is a reductionist model in Western science. It is the model of Western science, which wishes to reduce everything to physical processes. And many scientists will say, when you're on a hallucinogen, areas of your brain light up or shut down, and they will reduce the experience to those physical or biochemical changes in the brain. They will say that the experience is nothing more than what is happening in the brain. There is no reality to the experience. Just to show how stupid that is, consider the issue of a telescope. If you want to look at a very distant star with your telescope, you're going to have to point it at the right area of the sky, and then you're going to have to focus it. As you focus it, physical changes will take place within the barrel of the telescope in the relationship between the lenses. Eventually, the star will come into view. You'd be completely wrong to say that the star is the physical changes inside the barrel of the telescope. That's absolute rubbish. Those physical changes have simply enabled you to see the star. And this is the suggestion with the physical changes that go on in altered states of consciousness, that they may be allowing us to see into an expanded or far wider reality than our normal brain state constrains us to. Rick speaks about channel normal, that we're all tuned in pretty much to channel normal, to living in the physical realm. But that there are many other channels broadcasting at us all the time, and that maybe what the hallucinogens do, that we shouldn't think of the brain as a generator of consciousness, but rather as a receiver or a transceiver of consciousness. And what they do is they alter the receiver wavelength of the brain, rather as the telescope alters the focal capacities of the eye, allowing us to see that which we could not see with our basic senses. And Rick is quite open to the notion that what we're seeing into is parallel universes, freestanding parallel universes. That's just as likely as this being just entirely something generated within the brain. So perhaps we don't need the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland, to enter parallel universes or explore their secrets. Perhaps the universe has already given us the equipment. It's called our brains, And all we have to do is adjust the receiver wavelength of our brain to make contact with other realms and the entities that inhabit them. It's just a fact that at the moment that the great cave art began to appear, humanity went through an extraordinary behavioral change. It was as though we were shaken out of millions of years of rigidity. By this time, 40,000 years ago, our ancestors had been anatomically modern for more than 150,000 years. But the behavior was not modern. And you get this sudden transformation in behavior, really the dawn of spirituality, at the same time that you encounter the great cave art. And it's been suggested with good reason that possibly human language even came from those experiences that made the cave art possible. In other words, experiences with psychedelics. That certainly it suggests that psychedelics were transformational in the Stone Age, and as we know, they were transformational in the 60s and 70s as well. Both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak have said that they would never have done what they did if it hadn't been for LSD. And Steve Jobs used to employ programmers preferentially if they were experienced with LSD. So I think in closing, there's a huge amount to suggest that these substances, these psychedelics, have got absolutely nothing to do with brain candy and everything to do with transformation. That they are transformational entities, transformational intelligences, which have a huge and important role to play in the human story, which allow us to connect with nature and sense our place within nature once again, which we have so grievously lost. So what a huge mistake we may be making in our society today by demonizing and persecuting and creating an atmosphere of fear and paranoia and hatred around the issues of altered states of consciousness. We may be literally preventing the next step forward in our own evolution. Thank you. I believe that that if we're not sovereign over our own consciousness, and I'm echoing many other speakers here, if we're not sovereign over our own consciousness, if we're prepared to tolerate living in a society that will not allow sovereignty of an adult over his or her own consciousness, then we cannot be claimed to be free in any way. It's absolutely absurd and crazy for the Western democracies to be going around the world imposing democracy by force on other cultures when we actually live in a consciousness tyranny where it is even dangerous to speak out about these issues. We live in an atmosphere of witch hunt around this. And so that's why I hugely welcome conferences of this sort, which can become nodal points for a global change in consciousness and to realize that these plants are our allies and our friends. They have co-evolved with us. They are here to help us. And my goodness, there has never been a time when the human race has been more urgently in need of its plant allies than today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.